In 1941, Nazi Germany developed a secret plan called Unter Grund, an operation to completely destroy the Moscow metro. Hitler considered the Soviet underground not just a transportation system, but a symbol of Bolshevik ideology that had to be wiped off the face of the earth. Today, we will reveal the secrets of this sinister plan and find out why the Führer's plans proved unfeasible. Get ready to dive into one of the least known pages of the Great Patriotic War, where architectural masterpieces became impregnable fortresses and underground palaces for the people stood against the full might of the Nazi war machine. Time equals 1.0 seconds. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into little-known facts of history. And in the comments, write your opinion. Do you think that the Moscow metro could really have been a decisive factor in the defense of the capital? Or is its role exaggerated? What other architectural monuments have become military targets in history? Share your thoughts. In 1935, a miracle of Soviet engineering was born beneath the streets of Moscow, which would soon become the object of special attention from Nazi intelligence and Adolf Hitler himself. The Vladimir Lenin Moscow Metro opened on May 15th, becoming not just a means of transportation, but a symbol of the power of the Soviet Union and the technological superiority of socialism over capitalism. The first metro line stretched from Sokolniki Station to Park Kultury Station, with a branch to Smolenskaya Station, including 13 stations with a total length of 11 2/10 kilometers. Each station was a work of art, decorated with marble, granite, mosaics, and sculptures, demonstrating to the whole world the achievements of Soviet architecture and construction. The construction of the metro required technical solutions that were unprecedented at the time. Some stations were built at a depth of 35 meters, surpassing many European counterparts. Engineers used advanced shield tunneling methods and special waterproofing technologies to create an underground transport system capable of functioning in all conditions. Soviet propaganda actively used the image of the metro as proof of the superiority of the socialist system. The stations were called underground palaces for the people, emphasizing that ordinary workers and peasants had gained access to luxuries unavailable to the bourgeoisie in capitalist countries. This ideological component did not go unnoticed in Berlin. By the end of the 1930s, German diplomats and journalists visiting Moscow noted the impressive scale of the Moscow metro in their reports. They described not only the architectural splendor of the stations, but also the technical perfection of the entire system, realizing that the subway could be of strategic importance in the event of a military conflict. By 1940, the Moscow metro already had 22 stations on 2 lines, with a total length of 22.5 kilometers. Daily passenger traffic exceeded 500,000 people, making the Moscow metro one of the busiest transportation systems in the world. German analysts were particularly interested in the depth of Moscow's stations, which significantly exceeded European standards. They correctly assumed that such technical characteristics were not accidental and could be related to defense considerations. The metro was designed with the possibility of use as a bomb shelter in mind. The construction of the second phase of the metro, completed in 1938, impressed foreign observers even more. The Ring Line and the extension of the Sokolnicheskaya Line demonstrated the ambition of Soviet plans to develop an underground transport network covering the entire capital. On June 22, 1941, at 4 a.m. Moscow time, the life of the Moscow metro changed forever. With the start of the Great Patriotic War, the underground transformed from a transport artery into a vital element of the capital's defense, becoming a real underground city for hundreds of thousands of Muscovites. In the first days of the war, metro stations began to be used as bomb shelters. Their deep location, sturdy reinforced concrete structures, and advanced ventilation system made the underground an ideal place to hide from air raids. By the end of June 1941, more than 150,000 people were finding refuge in the metro every day. Organizing life in the underground required a radical restructuring of the metro's operations. Two-tier bunks, medical stations, cafeterias, and even libraries were set up in the stations. Trains continued to run, but the schedule was adjusted to take into account the number of people on the platforms and in the passages between stations. Deep stations were particularly heavily used. Mayakovskaya, Ploshchad Sverdlova, now Teatralnaya, Kirovskaya, now Chistye Prudi, and others. The Mayakovskaya station became the venue for a solemn meeting of the Moscow Council of Workers' Deputies on November 6, 1941, at which Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin spoke. The German command closely monitored the use of the Moscow metro as a shelter. Intelligence reports contained detailed information that the Soviet capital had a unique underground defense system capable of sheltering a significant part of the city's population from air raids. The Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the entrances to the metro, but the effectiveness of such attacks was extremely low. Multiple entrances and exits, deep lobbies, and the sturdy construction of the above-ground pavilions made the metro virtually invulnerable to airstrikes with conventional munitions. By the fall of 1941, German analysts had come to the conclusion that the Moscow metro was not just a transportation system, but a real underground fortress capable of supporting a significant part of the city's population during a siege. This information reached the Wehrmacht High Command and Adolf Hitler himself. Secret documents of Army Group Center mentioned for the first time the need to neutralize the Moscow underground transport system as one of the priority tasks in the capture of the Soviet capital. The metro went from being an ordinary city facility to a strategic target for the Nazi command. Life in the underground required Muscovites to adapt to new conditions. Families brought with them the bare necessities and organized shifts to maintain order and cleanliness. Despite the harsh conditions, the underground became a symbol of the resilience of the Soviet people and their willingness to defend their homeland at any cost. On October 2, 1941, Operation Typhoon began, the general offensive of the German fascist troops on Moscow, which was the culmination of the Barbarossa Plan. Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia developed not only military plans to capture the Soviet capital, but also detailed plans for its post-war reconstruction, with a special focus on the fate of the Moscow metro. The operation involved encircling and destroying the main forces of the Red Army west of Moscow, followed by a rapid advance on the city. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was tasked with capturing the Soviet capital before the onset of winter. The plans were not simply to take the city, but to bring it under complete Nazi control. Adolf Hitler personally studied intelligence reports on the Moscow metro, marveling at the scale and technical perfection of the Soviet underground. According to the recollections of participants in meetings at the Führer's headquarters, he repeatedly emphasized that the Bolshevik palaces, underground, were a symbol of the perverted priorities of the communist regime and must be destroyed. The Ostmaster Plan, which envisaged a radical restructuring of the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, contained a special section on Moscow. According to this document, the Soviet capital was to be renamed a city of German significance, and its population reduced to 500,000 people employed exclusively in the service of the German administration. In the context of these plans, the Moscow Metro was seen as a potentially useful but ideologically unacceptable piece of infrastructure. Nazi ideologues believed that the luxurious stations of the Soviet metro contradicted the principles of racial hierarchy, according to which subhumans should not have access to such architectural masterpieces. Albert Speer, chief architect of the Third Reich, was tasked with developing a plan for the reconstruction of Moscow after its capture. In his plans, the Moscow Metro was to be partially destroyed and partially converted for the needs of German settlers. The most ornate stations were to be blown up as monuments to Bolshevik propaganda. The mosaics and sculptures in the metro, glorifying the achievements of the Soviet people and the socialist system, were a particular source of irritation for the Nazi leadership. Hitler demanded that all traces of Bolshevik culture be wiped off the face of the earth, including the underground temples of communism, as he called the Moscow metro stations. Wehrmacht military analysts warned of the technical difficulties of destroying the metro. Its depth, the strength of its structures, and its extensive network of tunnels would require huge amounts of explosives and special expertise. However, political considerations outweighed technical difficulties. By the end of October 1941, German troops had advanced to within 25 to 30 kilometers of Moscow. The officers of Army Group Center carried detailed maps of the city with marked subway entrances and underground utility networks, obtained by intelligence before the war. Plans to destroy the Moscow metro became part of a broader program of denazification of the occupied territories, aimed at the complete eradication of Soviet ideology and culture. The metro was seen not as a transport system, but as an ideological symbol that had to be destroyed. As German troops approached Moscow in the fall of 1941, the Moscow metro demonstrated its unique defensive qualities, turning into a veritable underground fortress. The depth of the stations, originally determined by the geological features of the Moscow region and prestige considerations, unexpectedly proved to be a critical factor in the defense of the capital. The deep stations were located at a depth of 20 to 35 meters below ground, making them virtually invulnerable to artillery fire and aerial bombardment. Reinforced concrete arches up to 2 meters thick could withstand direct hits from large-caliber shells without damaging the integrity of the underground structures. The metro's ventilation system, designed with a large power reserve, could provide fresh air for up to 2 million people at a time. Filtration units could protect people not only from ordinary combustion products, but also from chemical weapons, the use of which the Germans seriously considered during the assault on Moscow. A distinctive feature of the Moscow metro was its autonomous power supply. The metro substations had backup power sources and could operate independently of the city's power grid. This meant that even if the above-ground communications were completely destroyed, the underground system would still be able to maintain lighting, ventilation, and communications. The extensive network of tunnels and technical rooms made it possible to move people and cargo around the city secretly, bypassing streets controlled by the enemy. Connecting lines between lines, service tunnels, and chambers turned the metro into a labyrinth that only specially trained people could navigate. By November 1941, there were about 400,000 people in the metro at any given time. Underground hospitals, schools, workshops, and even theater productions were organized. The Kirovskaya station became the site of the Vladimir Lenin State Library, and a radio station was set up at the Kurskaya station. German military engineers, studying captured documents and interrogating prisoners, came to the conclusion that the Moscow metro was practically impregnable by conventional military means. Storming the underground structures would have required enormous losses and special equipment, which the Wehrmacht did not have in sufficient quantities. The psychological effect of the underground fortress had a demoralizing effect on German soldiers. Many of them were encountering for the first time a city capable of literally going underground and continuing its resistance from inaccessible underground shelters. This destroyed their illusions of an easy victory and quick capture of the Soviet capital. The Soviet command actively used the defensive capabilities of the metro to house strategically important facilities. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies were stored in underground rooms. Some stations became command posts for district defense headquarters. The uniqueness of the Moscow situation was that the metro served simultaneously as a transport artery, bomb shelter, warehouse, hospital, and command center. No other underground system in the world had such multifunctionality, making the Moscow metro an unprecedented phenomenon in the history of urban defense. By the end of 1941, German strategists realized that capturing Moscow did not mean automatic control over the city. The underground Second Moscow could exist in parallel with the city above ground, posing a constant threat to the occupying forces and making normal life for the invaders virtually impossible. From the early 1930s, German intelligence systematically gathered information about the construction of the Moscow metro, understanding its potential strategic importance. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had detailed plans of the underground system of the Soviet capital long before the start of the Great Patriotic War. The main source of information was technical publications in Soviet engineering journals, which, in the spirit of international cooperation, contained detailed descriptions of construction solutions. Articles on shield tunneling methods, ventilation and waterproofing systems were carefully studied in Berlin and translated into German for military analysts. German diplomatic representatives in Moscow regularly visited metro stations under the guise of familiarizing themselves with the achievements of Soviet technology. Their reports contained not only admiring assessments of the architectural design, but also precise technical characteristics: depth of foundation, thickness of floors, and power of ventilation systems. The German specialists were particularly interested in the Palace of Soviet Station, now Kropotkinskaya, designed by architect Alexei Nikolaevich Dushkin. Its unique design, with rows of columns and a vaulted ceiling, was considered a model of underground architecture that could serve as a template for German projects. By 1939, German intelligence had complete plans of the Moscow metro, including sections under construction and planned extensions. This information was regularly updated through a network of agents working under the cover of trade and cultural ties between the two countries. The Abwehr was particularly interested in the technical facilities of the metro: ventilation shafts, electrical substations, and service tunnels. Understanding the engineering infrastructure was essential for planning operations to disable or capture the system in the event of war. German military engineers studied Soviet experience in construction in the difficult hydrogeological conditions of Moscow. Information on combating groundwater and reinforcing tunnels in unstable soils was of interest not only to intelligence, but also to the Reich's own underground projects. Reconnaissance reports contained detailed descriptions of the daily functioning of the metro: passenger flows, train schedules, and the organization of security services. This information was to be used to organize sabotage or capture key facilities in the event of war. By the summer of 1941, the German command had at its disposal not only plans for existing lines, but also designs for the third phase of subway construction. Knowledge of the planned tunnels and stations made it possible to anticipate evacuation routes and the location of strategic facilities by the Soviet command. Photographic materials collected by German intelligence included not only general views of stations, but also detailed photographs of technical units, ventilation grills, and track structures. These photographs were later used in planning operations to destroy or capture metro facilities. Particular attention was paid to studying the possibilities of using the metro for military purposes. German analysts correctly assumed that deep stations could serve as bomb shelters, and tunnels could be used for the covert movement of troops and cargo. These conclusions formed the basis for plans to neutralize Moscow's underground system. Intelligence reports on the Moscow Metro were regularly submitted to the General Staff of the Army and personally to Adolf Hitler. The Führer took a particular interest in underground structures, seeing them as both a military threat and an ideological challenge to the superiority of German engineering and architecture. The secret archives of the Third Reich contained ambitious plans for the reconstruction of Moscow after its supposed capture, in which the fate of the Moscow Metro was determined with German pedantry. The Ost Master Plan envisaged a radical transformation of the Soviet capital into a provincial German city, the administrative center of the Reichskommissariat, Moscow. Albert Speer, the Reich's chief architect, received personal instructions from Hitler to develop a concept for the use of Moscow's underground structures as part of a new urban development policy. The Führer believed that the Bolshevik underground palaces should either be completely destroyed or radically converted for true Aryans. According to Nazi racial theories, the luxurious stations of the Moscow Metro were an unjustified waste of resources on subhumans. Heinrich Himmler emphasized in his notes that underground structures of this level should be intended exclusively for German settlers, not for Slavic slaves. The plans called for the demolition of the most ornate stations, Mayakovskaya with its mosaic panels, Ploshchad Revolutsii with its sculptures of Soviet people, and Komsomolskaya with its majestic interiors. These stations were considered temples of Bolshevik propaganda and were to be destroyed without exception. The technical side of the planned destruction required detailed planning. German military engineers calculated the amount of explosives needed to demolish stations of various designs. Deeply buried stations with their powerful reinforced concrete arches presented particular difficulties. Part of the metro was planned to be preserved and converted for the needs of the German administration. It was intended to create underground shelters for senior occupation officials, warehouses for strategic materials, and secret laboratories. The tunnel system was ideal for covert movement around the city. The ideological component of the destruction plans was no less important than the practical one. Hitler repeatedly stated that the Soviet metro was a monument to the false ideology of equality and should be wiped off the face of the earth as a reminder of the Bolshevik delusion about the creative abilities of the lower races. The plans included the creation of a museum of Bolshevik stupidity in one of the preserved stations, where German settlers and tourists could see what wrong racial policy leads to. The exhibition was to demonstrate the irrational waste of resources by the communist regime. The mosaics and sculptures in the metro depicting Soviet people as heroes and builders of a new world were a particular source of irritation for Nazi ideologues. The complete destruction of all works of art glorifying socialist ideals and the achievements of the multinational Soviet people was planned. The architectural design of the Moscow metro, especially the use of various types of marble and granite, was to be dismantled and used for the construction of German facilities. Valuable finishing materials were to be taken to Germany to decorate truly Aryan buildings. The transport function of the remaining part of the metro was planned exclusively for the German population. Local residents, who were to be left behind as a labor force, were to be prohibited from using the underground transport as inappropriate for their status. The time frame for the implementation of the plans to destroy the metro was linked to the overall schedule for the Germanization of Moscow. It was assumed that the main work on the demolition of ideologically harmful stations would be completed during the first year of the occupation, before the arrival of mass German settlers. The financing of the destruction and conversion of the metro was to be carried out using confiscated Soviet resources and forced labor of the local population. The Nazis considered this work to be just retribution for the Bolsheviks for their crimes against humanity. By the winter of 1941, the Moscow metro had become a central element in the defense of the Soviet capital, becoming an integral part of the city's military engineering system. The Soviet command made maximum use of the unique characteristics of the underground transport network to create a multi-level defense system that was unparalleled in world military practice. The Supreme Command Headquarters developed special instructions for the use of the metro for military purposes. The document regulated the location of command posts, the organization of communications, the storage of ammunition, and the placement of reserves in underground structures. Each station was assigned specific tasks within the city's overall defense system. The Kirovskaya station became the reserve command post of the Moscow Military District. Secure lines of communication with the front lines were installed here, maps of combat operations were posted, and round-the-clock duty shifts for general staff officers were organized. The depth of the station provided complete protection from artillery fire and aerial bombardment. The tunnels between stations were equipped with ammunition, medicine, and food storage facilities. The third phase of construction was particularly active, with unfinished tunnels being converted into huge underground storage facilities for strategic reserves. The temperature and humidity in the subway were ideal for long-term storage of various materials. The subway ventilation system was upgraded to provide protection against chemical weapons. Additional filters and forced ventilation systems were installed, capable of creating excess pressure in underground rooms. This made the metro virtually invulnerable to gas attacks, which the Germans considered one of the ways to force the city to surrender. The underground workshops of the metro were converted for the production of military equipment. The Sokolniki depot was used to repair small arms, while the technical rooms of other stations were used to manufacture grenades and mines. Skilled metro workers quickly mastered military production using the available equipment. The connecting tunnels between the metro lines played a special role in the defense. These technical structures, not intended for passenger traffic, became hidden routes for the transfer of troops and cargo between different areas of the city. The enemy could not control these movements even when they captured individual areas of Moscow. The metro's medical service was significantly expanded. Operating rooms, X-ray rooms, and wards for the seriously wounded were set up in deep stations. The sterility of the underground premises and stable temperature created optimal conditions for treating the wounded. Many lives were saved thanks to the underground metro hospitals. Radio communication from underground premises was carried out through special antenna systems that were brought to the surface through ventilation shafts. This ensured constant communication between underground command posts and troops on the front lines and with the Supreme Command. The metro communication system became a backup for the entire city's defense. By December 1941, there were about 500,000 people in the metro. Soldiers, commanders, medical personnel, workers of military enterprises, and civilians. The underground city lived according to a special schedule, where everyone played their part in the common struggle for the independence of their homeland. The metro security system was reinforced by special NKVD units. Access control, tunnel patrols, and protection from saboteurs were all carried out by specially trained fighters who knew every corner of the underground system. The metro became an impregnable fortress, not only thanks to its engineering solutions, but also thanks to the human factor. The German command, receiving intelligence data on the scale of the Moscow metro's use for military purposes, came to the conclusion that it would be impossible to capture and hold Moscow without neutralizing the underground system. However, the technical capabilities of the Wehrmacht did not allow this task to be accomplished by conventional military means. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Moscow metro was transformed into a giant underground industrial complex, where military products were manufactured for the front. With many factories evacuated or destroyed, the underground workshops of the metro became a critical part of the military economy of the besieged capital. At the Sokolniki depot, the assembly of PPS-43 submachine guns was organized under the leadership of designer Alexei Ivanovich Sudayev. Using the subway's machine tools and the skills of its workers, production was ramped up to 1,000 submachine guns per month. The underground location completely protected the production facility from air raids. The technical rooms of the Krasnoselskaya station were converted into a factory for the production of anti-tank mines. The specialists working there mastered the manufacture of TM-35 mines, using casings made from scrap materials and explosives delivered through underground tunnels. Every day, the underground factory produced up to 200 mines of various types. The unfinished tunnels of the third line of the metro were used to house workshops for the production of F-1 grenades. The spacious underground galleries were ideal for assembly lines, and the ventilation system ensured the safety of work with explosives. Women and teenagers, who made up the bulk of the workforce, quickly mastered military production. The unique conditions of the metro allowed for the production of optical devices for sniper rifles. In rooms with a constant temperature and minimal vibration, it was possible to achieve high precision in the manufacture of lenses and prisms. The underground optical workshop supplied sniper sights to the Moscow front. The metro's electromechanical workshops mastered the repair of radio stations and telephone equipment. Qualified metro electricians and mechanics successfully repaired damaged communications equipment, returning it to service in a matter of hours. The underground workshops worked around the clock, providing communications for the capital's defense. A sewing workshop for winter clothing was set up in the service rooms of the Mayakovskaya station. Using fabric from evacuated factories, seamstresses and tailors made quilted jackets, ushanka hats, and mittens for Red Army soldiers. Warm clothing was critically important in the harsh winter of 1941. Underground metro bakeries worked at full capacity, providing bread not only to the civilian population, but also to military units. Up to 50,000 loaves of bread were baked every day and distributed throughout the city via a system of underground tunnels. Bread from the metro became a symbol of the resilience of besieged Moscow. Underground fuel and lubricant storage facilities were of particular importance. The technical rooms stored supplies of gasoline, diesel fuel, and oils necessary for the operation of military equipment. The underground location guaranteed the safety of the fuel, even if bombs hit the above-ground structures directly. The Metro's medical workshops set up production of bandages, simple medicines, and medical instruments. Pharmacists and doctors working in underground laboratories provided Metro hospitals with everything necessary to treat wounded soldiers. The supply system for underground enterprises was organized through special freight trains that ran through the Metro tunnels during non-working hours. Raw materials, supplies, and finished products were transported around the city, bypassing dangerous surface routes. The Metro became the lifeline of Moscow's war economy. By the spring of 1942, underground metro enterprises were producing up to 10% of all military products manufactured in Moscow. This figure showed that the Metro had become a fully fledged part of the defense industry, capable of functioning under any conditions. German intelligence officers who received fragmentary information about production activities in the Moscow Metro reported to their command that it was impossible to suppress the military potential of the Soviet capital by airstrikes alone. The underground factories required special methods of combat, which the Wehrmacht did not have at its disposal. The psychological impact of the Moscow Metro on German soldiers and officers was one of the unexpected factors that influenced the course of the Battle of Moscow in the winter of 1941 to 1942. The idea of an underground Moscow, capable of existing independently of the city above ground, demoralized the invaders and destroyed their confidence in the possibility of complete victory. The diaries and letters of German soldiers captured by Soviet troops contained numerous references to Russian moles capable of disappearing underground and reappearing in the most unexpected places. Legends about endless underground tunnels connecting all of Moscow spread among German troops faster than official command reports. Oberleutnant Kurt Meyer of the 2nd Panzer Army wrote in his diary, "This city cannot be captured by conventional means. Even if we occupy all the streets, the Russians will continue to fight from their underground palaces. We are not fighting an army, but an entire civilization that has gone underground." Wehrmacht officers who studied captured diagrams of the Moscow Metro came to the conclusion that it was practically impossible for a single army group to control the underground system. The length of the tunnels, the numerous entrances and exits, and the complex system of passages required a whole division of specially trained troops to control them effectively. Reports that Soviet troops could appear from under the ground behind German positions were particularly worrying. Although most of these cases were explained by the use of sewer collectors and basements, German soldiers associated them with the mysterious capabilities of the Moscow Metro. The propaganda company of Army Group Center was given a special task to discredit the Moscow Metro in the eyes of German troops. Leaflets described the subway as a Bolshevik trap for German soldiers and urged caution when entering any underground structures in Moscow. Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock noted in his memoirs that the Moscow Metro became an obsession for many officers in his army group. Planning operations was complicated by the need to take into account the possibility of the enemy moving secretly through underground communications. Rumors about secret military facilities in the depths of the Moscow Metro multiplied and became embellished with fantastic details. German soldiers told each other about underground factories capable of producing tanks, secret laboratories, and even underground airfields for Soviet aircraft. Attempts by German intelligence to infiltrate the operating stations of the Moscow Metro invariably ended in failure. The security system organized by the NKVD made it virtually impossible to obtain reliable information about the actual condition and use of the underground structures. Lieutenant General Walter Kerfin, commander of the 102nd Infantry Division, reported to Army headquarters, "The Moscow Metro is a military facility of a type unknown to us. Our regulations do not contain instructions for storming cities with a developed underground infrastructure. Special tactics need to be developed." Winter conditions intensified the psychological impact of the underground threat. Frozen and hungry German soldiers envied the warm underground shelters of Muscovites, imagining the comfortable conditions deep in the metro. The contrast between their own suffering and the supposed comfort of the enemy further demoralized the troops. Abwehr officers reported a decline in morale among units operating directly in Moscow or near it. Soldiers avoided patrolling near subway entrances, fearing sudden attacks from underground. Myths about the Moscow subway became a real factor, affecting the effectiveness of German troops. By the end of December 1941, the opinion was widespread among German troops that the war with the Soviet Union was fundamentally different from all previous Wehrmacht campaigns. The Moscow subway became a symbol of this difference, an incomprehensible, uncontrollable force capable of nullifying any military successes of the invaders. By January 1942, the headquarters of Army Group Center had developed a detailed plan for the physical destruction of the Moscow Metro, codenamed Unter Grund, underground. This secret document provided for a set of measures to completely disable the underground transport system of the Soviet capital. The Unter Grund plan was drawn up with the participation of the Reich's best military engineers, including demolition experts from SS engineering battalions. The document contained precise calculations of the amount of explosives needed to collapse tunnels of various designs and destroy stations of different types. To destroy deep stations, it was planned to use special high-explosive charges weighing up to 5 tons each. The explosives were to be placed at key points of the structures, where the arches met the supports, and in areas of maximum stress in the reinforced concrete structures. The destruction of subway tunnels laid in stable geological rocks at great depths presented particular difficulties. German engineers planned to use a method of directed explosion, in which a series of successive detonations would cause large sections of underground structures to collapse. To flood the metro, a plan was developed to destroy protective structures on the Moskva River and artificially divert water into the tunnels through ventilation shafts. Calculations showed that completely flooding the system would require the demolition of dams and pumping stations in several areas of the city. Chemical contamination of the metro was considered as an alternative way of putting it out of action. It was planned to use skin-irritating toxic substances that could render the underground premises unusable for a long period of time, without the need for physical destruction of the structures. The time frame for Operation Unter Grund was tied to the overall plan for the capture of Moscow. The destruction of the metro was to begin immediately after German troops broke through to the city center and be completed within 48 hours. Such a tight schedule required detailed advance preparation and precise coordination between various units. Logistical support for the operation included the delivery of more than 200 tons of various explosives, special equipment for demolition work, and chemical protection equipment for German sappers to Moscow. The scale of the resources required testified to the seriousness of the Nazi command's intentions. To carry out the Unter Grund plan, special assault groups were formed from the most experienced sappers and chemists. These units underwent special training in combat operations in underground conditions and studied the design features of the Moscow metro using captured drawings and photographs. Reconnaissance. Preparations for the operation included attempts to infiltrate agents into the metro services to obtain up-to-date information on security systems, the location of strategic facilities, and possible routes of penetration into technical rooms. Particular attention was paid to neutralizing Soviet metro security. The plans called for simultaneous attacks on all key facilities of the underground system in order to prevent organized resistance and sabotage by metro defenders. The psychological component of Operation Unter Grund was no less important than the technical one. The destruction of the metro was intended to demonstrate to Muscovites the futility of further resistance and the Germans' ability to destroy any fortifications. Extensive coverage of the operation was planned for propaganda purposes. Alternative plans envisaged the partial preservation of the metro for use by German troops as underground barracks and warehouses. However, Hitler insisted on the complete destruction of the Bolshevik underground palaces as a symbol of the Soviet ideology he hated. A technical review of the Unter Grund plan conducted in Berlin revealed significant risks for the German troops themselves. Large-scale explosions in the center of Moscow could have had unpredictable consequences for above-ground structures and posed a threat to the occupying forces. These considerations partially restrained the implementation of the most radical options of the plan. A realistic assessment of the technical complexity of destroying the Moscow metro, carried out by German military engineers in early 1942, revealed virtually insurmountable obstacles to the implementation of plans for the complete destruction of the Soviet capital's underground system. The main problem was the exceptional strength of the Moscow metro's structures, which surpassed all analogues known to German specialists. The reinforced concrete arches of the deep stations were up to 2.5 meters thick and were reinforced using unique Soviet technologies with multiple safety margins. The geological conditions in Moscow created additional difficulties for demolition work. The metro tunnels passed through dense Jurassic clay rocks with high load-bearing capacity. The collapse of such tunnels required the simultaneous creation of several large cavities over a considerable distance. Calculations by German engineers showed that to guarantee the destruction of a deep station such as Mayakovskaya, at least 10 tons of explosives would need to be placed at precisely defined points. Delivering and installing such a quantity of explosives in combat conditions was an extremely difficult technical task. The ventilation system of the Moscow metro, initially considered a vulnerable point for chemical attacks, proved to be virtually impregnable. Multiple ventilation shafts, a filter system, and the ability to completely shut down ventilation made chemical contamination ineffective. The metro's sophisticated drainage system posed a particular problem. Attempts to flood the tunnels were thwarted by powerful drainage systems and pumping stations capable of pumping out huge volumes of water. In addition, flooding could have damaged Moscow's above-ground structures, which the Germans needed for their own purposes. The multi-level structure of the Moscow metro created additional technical difficulties. Connecting tunnels, service rooms, and cable ducts formed a three-dimensional labyrinth, the complete destruction of which was practically impossible. Even if the main tunnels were destroyed, the system would remain partially functional. The time factor also worked against the German plans. Installing the quantities of explosives needed to destroy the metro would have required weeks of continuous work by specialists under active Soviet military opposition. Such work was impossible during combat operations. German sappers, who had experience in destroying bridges and fortifications in Europe, admitted that standard methods could not be used on the Moscow metro. The unique design solutions of Soviet engineers required the development of fundamentally new approaches to demolition. Logistical calculations showed that more than 500 tons of various explosives would need to be delivered to Moscow to fully implement the Unter Grund plan. Such a scale of supply was unrealistic, given the stretched communications and guerrilla warfare behind German lines. The qualifications of personnel also became a critical limitation. The few specialists in underground work were distributed among various fronts, and it was impossible to concentrate them in sufficient numbers near Moscow without compromising other Wehrmacht operations. Intelligence reports on the Moscow metro's security system indicated a high probability of preemptive action by Soviet sappers. The NKVD had detailed plans for countermining all key metro facilities, which made German operations extremely risky. Alternative methods of destruction, including the use of super-heavy bombs and high-powered artillery, were also deemed ineffective. The depth of the metro stations exceeded the penetration capabilities of any ammunition available to the German forces. By February 1942, German military engineers had come to the conclusion that the complete destruction of the Moscow metro was technically impossible with the forces of Army Group Center. This assessment was one of the factors that influenced the decision to cease active operations to capture the Soviet capital. The final report of the military engineers concluded that the Moscow metro was an engineering marvel of the Bolsheviks, the destruction of which would require resources comparable to those needed to conduct a major military operation. Such costs were deemed impractical even if Moscow were successfully captured. On December 6, 1941, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive near Moscow, marking the collapse not only of Hitler's military plans to capture the Soviet capital, but also of all plans to destroy the Moscow metro. Operation Typhoon ended in complete failure, and the Unter Grund plan remained only on paper in the secret archives of the Wehrmacht. The Soviet counteroffensive developed so rapidly that German units did not even have time to evacuate standard military equipment, let alone carry out their complex plans to destroy the underground structures. Army Group Center retreated from Moscow, leaving equipment and documents on the battlefield. During the liberation of the cities near Moscow, Soviet troops captured headquarters documents containing fragments of plans to destroy the metro. Among the trophies were diagrams showing the placement of explosives, calculations of the necessary charges, and instructions for sapper units. These documents revealed for the first time the scale of the German plans against the Moscow underground. Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock admitted in his post-war memoirs that the plans to destroy the Moscow metro were one of the most ambitious and at the same time unrealistic projects of Operation Typhoon. The technical complexity of the task was not properly assessed at the planning stage. By the end of December 1941, German troops had been pushed back 100 to 150 kilometers from Moscow. Special units assigned to carry out the Unter Grund plan suffered heavy losses in defensive battles and were partially transferred to other sections of the front. The Moscow metro not only survived as a transport system, but also made a decisive contribution to the defense of the capital. Underground factories continued to produce weapons, hospitals saved the wounded, and command posts coordinated the actions of the troops. The metro became a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the Soviet people. Attempts by the German Air Force to damage the metro in the final weeks of the Battle of Moscow proved fruitless. Bombing of metro entrances and ventilation shafts failed to seriously disrupt the functioning of the underground system. Most of the damage was repaired within a few hours by repair crews. The failure of the plans to destroy the Moscow metro became one of the symbols of the overall collapse of the Nazi blitzkrieg strategy on the Eastern Front. For the first time, the German command encountered an enemy capable of effectively using underground infrastructure for military purposes on such a large scale. In January 1942, Hitler ordered all documents related to plans against the Moscow metro to be classified. The Führer did not want information about the technical superiority of the Bolshevik engineers to become public knowledge in Germany or among the Reich's allies. An analysis of the failures near Moscow, conducted by the German Army General Staff, contained a special section on the underestimation of the enemy's underground fortifications. The experience of the Battle of Moscow forced the German military to reconsider its tactics for conducting combat operations in large cities. Officers of Army Group Center who participated in the development of the Unter Grund plan unanimously noted the utopian nature of the tasks set in their post-war memoirs. Colonel Günther Blumentritt wrote, "We planned to destroy something that was stronger than ancient Roman aqueducts and modern German bunkers." The Moscow metro continued to operate at full capacity throughout the war, demonstrating the highest level of Soviet engineering and organization. Not a single station was seriously damaged by German bombing, and the system as a whole never stopped working for more than a few hours. The psychological effect of the failure of the plans against the Moscow metro spread far beyond Army Group Center. German troops on other fronts received clear confirmation that the Soviet Union had technical capabilities that exceeded the preliminary estimates of German intelligence. By the spring of 1942, the Moscow metro had become an international symbol of the resilience of a besieged city. Western journalists wrote about the underground miracle of Moscow, and the USSR's allies studied the Soviet experience of using the metro for defensive purposes. The final collapse of the plans to destroy the Moscow metro meant not only military failure, but also the ideological defeat of Nazism. The underground palaces for the people withstood the full might of the German Wehrmacht, proving the viability and superiority of the socialist system over the fascist war machine. After the end of the Great Patriotic War and the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945, Allied troops discovered extensive documentation in German archives on plans to destroy the Moscow metro. These materials made it possible for the first time to fully assess the scale of the threat to the underground life of the Soviet capital. In the archives of the German Army General Staff, captured by American troops, detailed diagrams of the Moscow metro were found with marks indicating the locations for placing explosives. Each station had an individual destruction plan, developed taking into account its structural features. Researchers were particularly interested in Albert Speer's personal archive, which contained sketches of the reconstruction of the Moscow metro for the needs of German settlers. These documents showed that the Nazi leadership viewed the Soviet underground not only as a military target, but also as an ideological threat. In his testimony at the Nuremberg trials, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel confirmed that plans to destroy the Moscow metro were developed on Hitler's direct orders and were considered an integral part of the operation to capture the Soviet capital. The Führer personally approved the lists of stations to be destroyed first. Documents from the headquarters of Army Group Center contained correspondence between German military engineers and chemical warfare specialists on the possibility of using poisonous substances against the Moscow metro. Various types of gases and methods of delivering them to underground facilities through ventilation systems were discussed. American and British experts who studied the German plans concluded that they were technically unfeasible, even if Moscow were successfully captured. The Allied Commission's report concluded that the destruction of the Moscow metro would require resources comparable to those needed for a major military operation. The personal diaries of German officers who participated in the Battle of Moscow contain numerous references to the demoralizing effect of the Moscow subway on German troops. The officers described the subway as an impregnable underground fortress that seemed impossible to storm. Of particular interest were reports by German intelligence officers on the technical design of the Moscow metro. These documents showed that Nazi intelligence had detailed information about the construction of stations, ventilation systems, and power supply of the Soviet underground. Among the captured documents were secret instructions for German sappers on how to carry out sabotage operations in the Moscow subway. The instructions contained detailed diagrams of the placement of explosives and the sequence of detonations to achieve maximum destructive effect. French historians who gained access to German archives in the 1950s published research on Nazi plans against European subways. The Moscow subway occupied a special place in these plans as a symbol of Bolshevik ideology that must be destroyed. CIA documents declassified in the 1960s contained an analysis of German plans to destroy the Moscow metro, carried out by American military experts. The analysis confirmed the technical complexity of the tasks set by the Germans and the high level of Soviet engineering. Memoirs of German generals published in the post-war years unanimously acknowledged the underestimation of the technical characteristics of the Moscow metro. General Heinz Guderian wrote, "We planned a war against an army, but we encountered a civilization capable of going underground and continuing its resistance." Soviet archivists working with captured German documents established that planning for operations against the Moscow metro began as early as 1939, long before the attack on the USSR. This testified to the long-term nature of German plans to destroy the Soviet state. In the 1970s, British wartime intelligence documents containing assessments of German plans against the Moscow metro were declassified. British analysts correctly predicted the technical impracticability of the German plans and their propaganda nature. Post-war research established that the Moscow metro was the first example in history of the mass use of the underground as a complex defensive structure. This experience was studied by military experts from many countries and influenced the development of urban defense theory. The final declassification of German plans against the Moscow metro in the 1990s allowed historians to obtain a complete picture of Nazi intentions. Documents confirmed that the destruction of the Soviet underground was considered a key element of the policy of genocide against the Soviet people. In the post-war years, the Moscow metro was transformed from a target of German destruction plans into a symbol of the Soviet people's victory over fascism and a monument to engineering genius capable of withstanding any attempts at destruction. Each underground station became proof that the creative power of socialism was stronger than the destructive power of the Nazi war machine. The restoration and development of the Moscow metro in the early post-war years took on symbolic significance. The construction of new stations and lines demonstrated to the world the viability of the Soviet system and its ability not only to survive the war, but also to reach new heights in peaceful construction. By the 50th year of the 20th century, the length of the Moscow metro had doubled compared to the pre-war period. New stations, such as Park Kultury, Novoslobodskaya, and Komsomolskaya on the Ring Line, surpassed pre-war structures in architectural splendor. confirming the superiority of Soviet aesthetics over Nazi primitivism. The Komsomolskaya station on the Ring Line, opened in January 1952, became a true anthem to victory. Its mosaic panels depicting great Russian commanders and moments of military glory served as a reminder that the metro not only survived the war, but also glorified the heroes who defended their homeland. The reconstruction of pre-war stations damaged by bombing took on special significance. Each restored decorative element and each repaired mosaic became an act of historical justice, a symbol that the Nazis' barbaric plans had been completely defeated. In the 1950s, the Moscow Metro became a place of pilgrimage for delegations from socialist countries. Representatives from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary studied the Soviet experience in creating underground transportation systems capable of serving not only civilian, but also defensive purposes. Technical documentation on the operation of the Moscow Metro during the war was partially declassified and handed over to the Warsaw Pact countries. This experience was used in the construction of metro systems in Prague, Budapest, and other capitals of socialist states. The memorialization of the military history of the Moscow Metro began in the early post-war years. Memorial plaques were installed at stations to remind people that the underground served as a bomb shelter, hospital, and command post. These memorial signs became part of the historical memory of the people. In the 1960s, the Moscow Metro became an international tourist attraction. Foreign visitors came to the USSR specifically to see the underground palaces that the Nazis had been unable to destroy. The metro became a symbol of the indomitable Soviet spirit. Scientific research into the design of the Moscow Metro, carried out in the post-war period, confirmed the correctness of the engineering solutions used in its construction. The reserves of strength, which seemed excessive in peacetime, proved to be vital in wartime conditions. In the 1970s, a museum exhibition dedicated to the history of the Moscow Metro during the war was created. Visitors could see authentic wartime documents, photographs of underground hospitals and workshops, as well as captured German plans for the destruction of the metro. The architectural heritage of the Moscow Metro from the war period was placed under state protection. Stations that served as bomb shelters were given the status of historical and cultural monuments. Their original appearance was preserved as evidence of a heroic past. In the 1980s, additional documents about the Nazis' plans for the Moscow Metro were declassified. These materials formed the basis for scientific research and documentary films about little-known pages of the Great Patriotic War. International recognition of the historical significance of the Moscow Metro reached its peak with its inclusion in the UNESCO World Heritage List. The organization noted the uniqueness of the Soviet experience in creating an underground transport system capable of performing defensive functions. By the 1990s, the Moscow Metro had finally established itself as a symbol of the victory of creative forces over destructive ones. The story of its resistance to Nazi plans for destruction has become an integral part of the national memory of the Great Patriotic War. Modern research confirms that the Moscow Metro during the war was a unique phenomenon in world history, a transportation system that became an impregnable underground fortress. This experience remains relevant to modern theories of urban defense and civil protection. The history of the Moscow Metro's resistance to Nazi plans for its destruction has become an important lesson for the present day, demonstrating the power of the human spirit and engineering genius in the face of barbarism and destruction. This experience is particularly relevant in the 21st century, when the world is once again facing the threats of international terrorism and attempts to destroy humanity's cultural heritage. The technical heritage of the wartime Moscow Metro continues to influence modern approaches to the design of dual-purpose urban infrastructure. The principles laid down by Soviet engineers during the construction of the underground, increased structural strength, autonomous life support systems, multiple evacuation routes, have become the standard for modern metro systems around the world. The experience of using the Moscow Metro as a bomb shelter is being studied by modern civil defense specialists. The ability of the underground transport system to ensure the safety of hundreds of thousands of people in extreme conditions remains a unique example of the effective organization of mass protection of the population. The historical memory of the war years of the Moscow Metro is preserved in museum exhibitions, memorial complexes, and educational programs. Younger generations of Russians study this period as an example of their ancestors' fortitude and self-sacrifice, their willingness to defend cultural values at any cost. The international scientific community continues to study the phenomenon of the Moscow Metro as a unique case of the successful integration of transport and defense functions in urban infrastructure. Publications in scientific journals in various countries analyze the technical and organizational aspects of this experience. Contemporary architects and urban planners are studying the principles of creating public spaces capable of performing multiple functions in critical situations. The Moscow Metro has become a classic example of how transport infrastructure can serve as the basis for creating sustainable urban systems. The psychological aspects of the Moscow Metro's resistance to Nazi plans remain a subject of study for military psychologists and sociologists. The ability of the underground system to maintain the morale of the population under siege demonstrates the importance of cultural and aesthetic components in the organization of life support during crises. Documentary evidence of plans to destroy the Moscow Metro is used in contemporary programs on the study of war crimes and genocide. These materials serve as a reminder of the extremes to which the ideology of racial superiority and cultural chauvinism can lead. Technological solutions first used in the Moscow Metro during wartime have found application in modern critical infrastructure protection systems. The principles of redundancy, system duplication, and the creation of autonomous life support circuits have become the basis for the design of strategically important facilities. The educational significance of the history of the Moscow Metro cannot be overestimated. In school and university programs, this material is used to illustrate the interconnection between technical progress, social organization, and society's ability to withstand external threats. International cultural heritage organizations regularly refer to the experience of preserving the Moscow Metro as an example of the successful protection of architectural monuments in wartime. This experience is particularly relevant in the context of modern conflicts, where cultural sites are targeted by terrorist attacks. Contemporary research confirms that the success of the Moscow Metro in countering Nazi plans was due not only to the technical characteristics of the structures, but also to the high level of social organization of Soviet society. The ability of millions of people to self-organize and help each other was a decisive factor in their survival. The lessons of the Moscow Metro's history remain relevant for understanding the role of urban infrastructure in ensuring national security. In an era of new challenges and threats, the experience of creating multifunctional, sustainable urban systems is of strategic importance. The memory of how the Moscow Metro withstood the Nazi plans for destruction serves as a source of inspiration for modern generations of engineers, architects, and urban planners. It reminds us that technical achievements should serve not only convenience, but also the protection of human civilization. The legacy of the Moscow metro during the war years lives on in the stone and metal of its stations, in the memory of the people, and in the principles of modern urban planning. The story of the resistance to Nazi plans for destruction has become an integral part of the global experience of protecting cultural values and human dignity from the forces of barbarism and destruction.